Welcome to the fifth Nisos Advanced Persistent Talk videocast. I'm Landon Winklevoss, co-founder of Nisos, and will be today's host. We bring 3 to 5 subject matter experts between vendors and industry in a panel-style discussion on a hot topic of investigation and cybersecurity. Today's topic will be the discussion on building cyber fusion centers. As security operations teams grow and mature in sophistication, so do the multitude of threats that organizations face from cyber actors, fraudsters, disinformation actors, and even insider threats. Many of these types of threats affect numerous parts of the business and very much takes a fusion center approach through the enterprise. Joining me on the panel today is Jacob Norwood, Global Head of Fusion Center for Citi. Next, we have Matt Nyman, Cyber Fusion Center Director for American Family Insurance, followed by John Newhouse, Managing Director at Nisos. And rounding out the team, we have AJ Nash, Senior Director of Cyber Intelligence Strategy at Anomaly. So kind of diving right into the questions, right into the topics and around building a cyber fusion center. Certainly a lot of expertise and looking forward to get into this. Many large companies are building cyber fusion centers to combat and disrupt digital threats across the business that are happening at such a rapid scale. What are some examples of those threats, and how do you bring different parts of the security apparatus and even the business together to collaborate? Matt, you want to take first shot, followed by Jake and AJ, then John?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the types of attacks that Fusion Center can help solve for is ATM cash outs. And what makes them so difficult is there's a convergence between physical cyber and fraud. And talking about bringing together folks from not only the security, bringing together the business units that interact with those customers, with the banks, bringing in the fraud units that you can leverage some of the tools to mitigate that fraud. And then some of your traditional teams such as intelligence. And, with that sort of attack, it takes a network to defeat a network. You're then relying on some of your external partners around the globe for intelligence sharing, so you can get out ahead of those type of attacks. Another attack that, is recently there's been a lot of denial of service attacks for ransom, right? And that then you've got to bring in the networking side, which traditionally didn't sit with the security operations center. So those are a couple of the different types of attacks that, really challenge a traditional model that a fusion center will help solve for.
When I look at the fusion center, I actually think the first adversary we're trying to combat is ourselves. A fusion center is a solution to all the problems that we have as an organization, whatever that organization is, right? And the bigger the organization, the more arcane that organization, the more you need some kind of horizontal cut like a fusion center. The kinds of threats, external threats, if you will, that you're combating through it are going to largely come down to those threats that cross multiple boundaries within your organization. So the bigger your organization, the more boundaries it has, the more threats are rationally managed through fusion center operations. Great examples might be something like third-party compromise. And I don't mean that third party has gotten compromised and now it's coming into your network. That's already a different kind of incident response. But rather, you find out that a trusted third party with whom you have direct business-to-business connection has been compromised. Immediately, how do you react? Do you sever that connection? If you sever that connection, what's the business impact? And so already you've got information security, third-party assessments, you have the business involved and possible downstream effects to your clients and to your customers. Fusion centers bring all that information together in one place so you can figure that information out in minutes to hours instead of like finding out that you missed that important thing a week later and you've been losing money ever since. That's really, to me, what a fusion center brings to any size operation.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Matt and Jacob both covered, a couple of really big possible, problems, right? So huge points. From my standpoint, I also look at it a little bit from the physical side of things. Being able to take a look at executive protection, resilience, and even insider threat. Traditionally, those are organizations that often get split out, and the SOC works within the SOC and supports itself, but doesn't necessarily have great connections in those organizations. But especially now, as we've become a whole different world in the post-COVID world, that we have people everywhere. We have to have a lot more discussions about how that changes the threats. Insider threat is a very different environment now when they're everywhere, and we have to change how we're managing that. Executive protection, if they are still traveling, where they're going, and physical security that goes with that, and the resilience piece that goes along with it. And I think being able to have an organization where you are combining your cyber concerns and your intelligence accesses related to cyber threats along with physical and insider, is another opportunity for success. There's been a lot of gaps in the past where we've seen, there's cracks between these organizations and things can fall through. But being able to unify those, I think, is very helpful. And there's also a cost savings to that. A lot of these organizations have shared needs when it comes to intelligence. And we've seen organizations that are set up, enterprises set up where you have competing budget, essentially. You have folks that are buying for intel in different organizations. That's the same intel if they were to put it all together in a fused organization. So by going with a fusion center, you end up with shared visibility, shared cost, and a much better opportunity to protect people, I think.
Yeah, I 100% agree with you guys. The cross-team collaboration is essential as the threats evolve. Having worked in a few of these fusion centers already myself, you get to watch it evolve from the network defense side to also start to include the insider threat. And I mean, one of the things I always go back to when I think of how like the fusion center started and how it evolved is the APT-28 attacks. So like the Russia stuff where you had the beginnings of the cyber attack and they couldn't get in that way. So they went straight to physical where they're sitting in your parking lot and they're out there with giant antennas trying to breach your Wi-Fi access. So if you didn't have the cross collaboration of the teams working there together, there's no way you would have been able to be like, this actor's here, this actor's there, and they're all trying to access the same target.
Going down a couple of rabbit holes there from what people said, I'm just curious, Jacob, from your perspective, you mentioned a third party, ultimately getting breached and even having connection certainly to the network. I've talked to Fortune, 10 type of companies that very, mature security teams where they would even watch what the people are doing, watch where the breach is coming from a third party, really to get context of what they're ultimately trying to look for. I'm just curious what your thoughts are there. Would that be something that, a major FI would do? Would they just cut it right off at the pass? Kind of talk through just the different maturity levels or the different responses that there might be on something like that.
The shortest answer is maybe. The more blunt answer is probably not. And the reason is that the very nature of what we do is certainty is always difficult to come by. When you speak with a company and you're working through an incident response and you say, all right, is the bad guy out? Be like, yeah, we're confident. Okay, well, do you have evidence the bad guy's out? Well, we haven't seen any activity in 3 weeks. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, right? And so one of the things that I think we have to be very cognizant about when we're protecting customer data, when we are critical infrastructure, when we are a highly regulated entity, is if we say, well, we're just going to observe for a minute and see what they do so we can learn more. And during that window, they do something that we didn't see that was bad, we're accountable for that. So I think that the short answer is maybe, and the long answer is probably not. But we'd like to get there to have that degree of confidence. I just don't know that it exists quite yet.
I generally agree with Jake on that. We definitely would love to have the insight. Although I would generally lean more on the government since they have are tracking the most sophisticated actors closest. But I think about what's the brand reputation impact. If we knew they were in our network and we chose to watch as opposed to get it out of our network and then something bad did happen, I think that it would be a lot bigger impact to your brand if that fact came out. And so I would definitely lean towards just taking the blunt answer that Jake mentioned and getting him out of the network.
Moving on, what is the level of maturity of a security team and where it needs to be for a fusion center? What are the elements of data that are important to log and automate for action in both cyber and physical security?
Yeah, so I think if your organization is thinking about building a fusion center and you're trying to decide if you're mature enough, I'd say that as soon as you had the thought, maybe you should do this, you're probably mature enough. Because what you're looking at has more to do with how much you're dealing with. If your entire security operation is you, whereas you plus 3 Muldoons, that's it. You're good. You have a fusion center. You may not call it that, but you're all working in the same room. As organizations begin to silo, when your vulnerability assessment team is not necessarily really the same organization as your intelligence team, is really not the same organization as your investigations team, is really not the same organization as your SOC anymore, now you're in desperate need of a fusion center. If you had started building one earlier, before you reach that kind of siloed maturity, then you never hit that siloed phase. You get to kind of grow through it. So I would actually say, if your organization is considering doing it, go ahead and start now. As to what information you need to bring in, I would say all of it, everything. But more realistically, all of the information that gets acted on. There's a phrase that's been bandied about for the last 10 or 15 years called actionable intelligence. And, many of us here on this call have intelligence backgrounds. And so we remember parroting that faithfully in 2008, saying we sell actionable intelligence. And then I sat on a panel, or rather in a round table, that maybe in like 2014, and I had a whole bunch of CISOs in the room, and I was selling threat intelligence at the time. So I'm like, oh, I got a great idea. I'm going to ask them what actionable intelligence is, and then later I'm going to sell that. So I said, what is actionable intelligence? And there were 12 CISOs in the room. I got 14 answers. But I've cracked the code. I really have. I've cracked the code. Actionable intelligence is intelligence upon which someone is obligated to act. Not that they can act on, they're accountable for it. They lose their job, they get a fine, they go to jail, they're openly negligent. That is, to me, the definition of actionable intelligence. Your organization, based on how you're regulated, based on what your risk appetite is, based on what your security posture is, already knows what those things that you're accountable for are. That's the data that goes into your Fusion Center first. And you get all of it in there, and then you begin looking at across those boundaries and start seeing where it comes together. And that's the fusion piece. That's what I would do.
Everybody wants to have all the data all the time. I 100% agree with that. I want to get every system logged into Splunk and everything's queryable. But I think one of the things that I came across when I was working in these data centers was the intelligence fatigue. You see all of these threats and all these alerts coming across every single day, what's false positive, what's actually relevant. So when you start cutting through the noise, you have to get down to the actual alerts that matter to your organization and which ones that are of utmost importance, and taking care of those first. And then that goes along the lines of your actionable intelligence that you were talking about. So just to like build upon it, you have to have your data sources from outside your firewall, your data sources from inside your firewall, and pretty much any physical system access that you can think of, if just off the top of my head, for good intelligence.
So, as going along the data, I totally agree that it's all about your actionable intelligence. I think the one place, that I would expand is you go into an organization that has a lot of acquisitions, right? I think there's a lot of opportunity to consolidate some of that data because you can identify what's going on at a broader enterprise level. And also you might potentially pick up on something one of your subsidiaries is experiencing so that you can proactively go out and protect the rest of the enterprise against. Going back to the maturity, a fusion center, like Jake was saying, it really does solve for organizations that have scaled. Right? You just get so big that you've got inefficiencies in communication, and you need to be able to operate at the speed that the threats are out there. And so it's all about a cross-cutting function across an organization. But that doesn't mean that every single one of your teams within the organization needs to be fully mature, waiting for somebody to just come in and put them all together. I think the best analogy or best experience I have to draw on that talks to this is in a fusion center that I built going after drug cartels with a foreign nation, right? Their military did not have a good intelligence capability. And obviously it's intelligence-driven operations. So that is a key tenet of a fusion center. And they, literally gave us folks that their prior job was collecting trash for the military. And it was, okay, here you go. You figure out what to do. So we had to build up that intelligence team, right? And establish what it is they did and how they did it. So, there's pros and cons to every level of maturity, but agree with Jake. If you're thinking about it, it's probably the right time to do it.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm familiar with the nation state you're talking about there. That was a fun time. But you talk about the maturity. I think I want to look at it from a different angle, right? I think organizationally, you're both, all three of you are right on. If you're thinking of doing it, do it. I think the maturity is more about individual maturity and more about professional maturity of people as opposed to the organization as a whole. The challenge you run into when you want to start setting up a fusion center is a lot of times going to come down to politics and personalities, and making sure leadership has done a good enough job of expressing their support of the process and what we're trying to accomplish, and that this isn't meant to threaten anybody. This is about finding better ways to work together, not because anybody has been doing a poor job previously. It's just about efficiencies and getting better relationships built. And I think that's where some of the maturity breaks down is organizations sometimes aren't very, very healthy. And so you have too much infighting and too much conflict. And if you have people that don't want this to succeed, you're going to have a really hard time succeeding, quite frankly. It can be blown up from inside. So I worry more about that. From the data standpoint, as everybody said, listen, I'm an Intel guy. I want every bit of data that you can give me, whatever it is. But if it creates noise, John, you mentioned that. And, it'll sound self-serving. I'll say it just because of where I happen to be. But technologies help a lot with that. You bring in the right technologies and the right platforms that can give you better clarity on what you're getting. You don't want to get less intel. You want to use technology to make sense of it for you and bring forth the things that matter most to you. So I am a big believer in a lot of technologies, a lot of really good vendors that can help us with these problems, so that we can bring in enough intelligence that we can get the job done. I will say one thing. I depart a little bit from people who talk about actionable and informational. And Jacob, I think your definition is amazing. Actionable is things I have to do, not things I can do, right? I think that's a huge differentiator. But I also talk to folks about the importance of informational intelligence. If you're going to have an intelligence-driven organization, at some point we have to get there. Early on, dead on, you got to work out the actionable things I can do things about, things I have to do things about. But organizations often never mature to the point where they say we're going to care about the informational, and informational becomes actionable at some point. I used to tell people, in government, we have tens of thousands of analysts doing intel work. Not everybody's focused on the big 5 targets. Somebody is studying Bolivia. Now, I don't think Bolivia is a problem today, as far as I know, but if Bolivia becomes my problem, that's not the day to learn about Bolivia. I already need to know about it. So we need to be able to at least take in some of this informational intelligence to understand the larger threat environments and adversaries that may not be our problem today, but could become them, and especially become less myopic. If I'm a bank, banking isn't my only problem. All right, retail concerns are my problem, healthcare are my problem. If I'm an insurance company, nation states are still my problem and how they're attacking. Things get reused, adversaries recycle. So I think it's important to look at the bigger picture, which sometimes means taking a look at informational intelligence so we can be prepared in advance. But I'm with you, Jacob. It does come in behind. First is the things I must do, then the things I can do, and then the things I really need to know about so I can be prepared.
That's an amazing point, AJ. I think one of the things we look at on that accountability scale, at least the way that I view it, also is you got to think about the things you might be accountable for one day. If you're going to be accountable for Bolivia one day, somebody needs to have done that work. And that's really difficult for a lot of organizations that are looking at the ROI on their intelligence organization. And they're saying, you've written all these papers on nation state X. They're not attacking us. Why do I care? The day they attack, you care a lot. And I can certainly point in times within our organization, where that's happened, where we have volumes of data we've collected over time, volumes of analysis we've done. The analysts are like, nobody cares. They're never going to care. And then a thing happens and suddenly they care a lot. And that's part of what you can do with all your data, right? Not just your internal and external intelligence, but your internal intelligence. Landon, one other thing that I wanted to throw out there is we were talking about maturity. And this is something I've seen as fusion centers. If your listeners set up a fusion center, or if they've set one up recently and they're like, man, this doesn't work like you guys said at all. It's a mess. Nobody talks. Like there's dirty stairs across the floor. It's like a Morricone movie, every time I walk in there. What I have seen is I've either set fusion centers up or observed fusion centers over the last, 6 years or so, is the first 2 years, it's like that awkward hug at the end of Step Brothers, right? Like they have to be close and they don't want to, and they're shoving at each other while they're embracing, and it's real ugly, right? 2 years later, they're hanging out, they're kind of friends, but there's no real system in place yet, right? If I ask for something, I get it, but if I don't ask, it doesn't come. It's not until you get into that, that 4 to 6 year window where you start seeing fusion centers really become fusion centers. And that's in part because the people who didn't want to hug on year 0 are gone. And sometimes that's because people finally realize they have an incident or there's some defining event and they realize they really are all better together, and then they're bought in. And so I think if your organization out there in listener land is setting a fusion center up or feeling discouraged in your first 2 years, it's normal. Stick with it. It works, I promise.
That's a huge point. You brought up 2 big ones when you talk about ROI. The first one, that informational intelligence, right? ROI is a challenge. I've had the same experience you have. We've done intel. People are like, I don't know why you're doing this. This doesn't help us. I found that if you build really good intel requirements and you can tie your informational intelligence to those, at least you can help explain it a little bit better. But some of it is about understanding the investment and making sure leadership gets it. And it's the same thing with what you just said in the fusion center. if you aren't committed as an organization, if the leader doesn't have this vision and understand just how much effort it'll take, as you said, it's years, then you're going to fail. The organization's going to have problems. People are going to push back. People are going to fight this. It's human nature. And if you're not able to withstand that, if you aren't resilient to the pushback as a leader, then this isn't going to work out. After a couple of years, you're going to give up and go back to what you were doing. You got to be able to push all the way through. And I think you make an excellent point about that. This is several years, but the long-standing benefits are worth it. At least we think so.
I think something I thought of a little bit to both of your comments, AJ, Jake, is, most concisely, I feel like a fusion center creates a shared consciousness and purpose in an organization, right? The consciousness, going to AJ's comments about the informational intelligence, right, is educating the entire organization on what the threats are, what's going on. The other aspect of the shared consciousness is understanding all of those business units, what they do and what they need to succeed. Going to that awkward hug in the beginning, right? In almost every case, when I've started fusion centers and I go and I have business units identify what it is they do and what sort of things they need. In every case, I've had at least one other business unit say, oh, wow, I should have been receiving something from you. And then likewise, somebody else says, oh, wow, I should have been supporting you this entire time, right? And then going to that, how long does it take to fully mature? To Jake, your comment of how it takes a few years, that shared purpose to where it's organic, right? And everybody is actually working together, providing what their core competency is to that shared purpose of an organization.
One question I have as a follow-on just to what Jake was saying. Jake, you mentioned, decisive comment. What is actionable is what you have to do. We've all been in this for a while. I've generally seen, particularly when you come to security professionals, two main mindsets. You have risk, compliance, governance, legal mindseted security professionals. And then the other side of that, you have people that maybe they came out of the government, maybe they come out of the IC, maybe a little bit of combination of both. I guess the question really, I guess I'll start ask to Jacob. And from that perspective, if you, let's say, have a risk in looking at those two mindsets, I guess, what is it you have to do?
So, I mean, what are the two mindsets really, right? I think one of the benefits of working in the financial sector is that the regulations are so risk-based and so deep in the financial sector. It is difficult to imagine if you are in the innovative category on all of your, on all of your regulatory exam, right? You're probably actually legit in the innovative category. So that's a benefit. It's a challenge for logistical reasons, but I think it's a benefit that we have in this industry. And I think that a lot of other industries, while they maybe get an extra 30 minutes of sleep every night because they're not sort of chasing those goals, or at a little bit of a disadvantage, to be honest, because they don't have that kind of pressure on their senior leadership. And so instead, it behooves us to explain to our senior leadership why these things are important. And I think there's a difference in those areas. I think that a risk-based approach is correct. I think that we have a challenge in this field in correctly explaining the risk. And I don't just mean in saying, here's the risks if we don't do this thing, but in helping people understand that risks are in fact something that you accept. So, you take the example of, we have no tolerance to be breached by an external adversary. Nobody here has any tolerance to be breached by an external adversary. Every one of us will stop everything that we are doing and walk and work 100 hours, 200 hours. I don't even know if there are 200 hours in a week, but we'll work all the hours in the week if an adversary is in the network. And yet, by doing business on the internet, you have accepted some risk of there being an adversary on the network. And I think that's the risk conversation that we need to be having. I think that that's the risk conversation that more and more we see frameworks beginning to adopt. I think that it really comes down to understanding the difference between not tolerating something and acknowledging that it's part of the landscape.
So let's say you get information that a nation state is using a third-party cutout to conduct espionage, computer network exploitation against the U.S. financial sector. There's no further details. How do you use the fusion model to attack that problem? John, AJ, then Jake, then Matt.
I mean, first we have to accept that they're attacking a larger financial institution, right? So we have to evaluate the financial institution that we work for. So say you're a small local bank, you probably don't have the same threat surface or the same kind of adversarial consideration for your smaller bank. And then we can start to look at the actual attack methodology that is being used by the APT or a foreign actor. And from that, we can start to derive either selectors or just indicators, which can then be used to relay into our Cyber Fusion Center. And we can start to search for those indicators off the bat for a little bit of a preemptive search and try to prep ourselves for what may come, maybe not what's actually coming. And then if they're exploiting a certain system or something like that, just make sure everything's up to date. Just take that proactive stance that we can based on everything that we already know, instead of dealing with the actionable intelligence after the fact that somebody's in our network.
Yeah, so it's an interesting question. You know, a lot of it depends on what I'm given. You know, we know we have a nation state, we know we have a third party cutout, and we know the espionage involved. So I'm going to take some assumptions to go along with that. So I'm going to start digging in based on my knowledge of that nation state actor or group. I'm going to do a ton of research to find out what's been known in the past, right? What have we seen in the past? What are the known IOCs associated with them? What architecture have they used? What have their motives been? Which is going to help me understand who I should be reaching out to next. And take a look at that third party that they may be using as a cutout and see what we know about them. Because I want to very quickly be able to, as an intel guy, I want to be able to reach out to anybody who can take action. You know, as Jake's mentioned a couple of times, how important that is, right? I need to be able to very quickly notify the hunt team if we're looking for something in our environment, be able to notify, incident response if we think we've already been compromised, depending on what the information gives me. And have a quick talk with leadership to explain what we've been informed of and what we're doing to defend against this, right? This could even kick off an incident response type of an activity, even though we don't necessarily have an identified incident yet. I'm a big believer in being proactive in that. I would want to engage with several organizations that we may think could be involved and give them a heads up and say, this is what we're looking at. It's preliminary intelligence. Don't run with your head cut off like a chicken, but we want you to know early on what's going on here, and here's where we stand today. And very quickly, I want to be able to tie back whatever I can about that adversary to the known structures, whether it's MITRE attack framework or the kill chain, whatever we have for knowledge, so we can quickly start informing people of what we know, what we think our risk is. Jake hit it on the head with risk. Risk is everything. So how quickly can we explain what the likelihood is that this threat is going to become our problem, and how do we gauge that and measure that? And if we think it's a problem, what are we doing about it? And if we don't, let's explain why we don't think this is our problem to leadership as quickly as possible, so we can also mitigate panic. So I mean, those are the things that would come to mind for me right away.
I agree with all those comments, and I think I'll add to them instead of all offering an alternative. And for me, I think it comes down to prioritization and preparation. So the prioritization piece is like this: we have no tolerance for a nation state actor being on our network. We didn't yesterday, we don't now, and we don't now that we hear that it might be imminent. What would we do different? Well, if we would do it now, we should have been doing it yesterday. So I don't know that we're actually going to do much different, except we're going to take a look at all the things that we haven't done yet, that we haven't fixed yet. Outstanding patches, outstanding remediations from stuff that we know we did wrong a while back and that we're still fixing it. You always have this huge backlog of stuff you're making better, right? Based on what you know about that actor, and based on what you know about those areas that you're still making better, you might want to move a couple areas up to the front of the queue, right? Things that you were going to get done by the end of the year, now you're going to get done right now. That means something else has to wait because there's only so many resources, even in a large organization. But the idea is that if you think it's going to come in through a third party and you had planned enhancements to your third party monitoring apparatus, now's the time to take a look at where that is and maybe put some more resources into it. So on the preparation side, start getting your call trees ready. Get your government contacts ready. Get your peer FIs ready. Say, hey, listen, if this happens to you, let's talk. Do we have an NDA? We don't have an NDA. Oh my gosh, let's get an NDA. Get all that stuff in place so that when it happens, you're not scrambling and waiting 3 days to get the NDA in place before anyone's willing to share that privileged and confidential information. Talk to your lawyers. Say, listen, in the event that this happens, we might want to speak with another group, with an incident response group, or with another bank through you, so that everything's under privilege. Get those things ready, and if you have the time, run a battle drill, run an exercise, do a tabletop, and you'll learn a lot about yourself real fast if you do that.
Jake, one of the things I was thinking about, as you were saying in the beginning, is the saying of never waste a good crisis, right? And use that as an opportunity to push through the things you've been thinking about. But expounding on what you were talking about is you really need to have everything in place ahead of time when you're talking about dealing with a nation state. Talking about the NDAs, what I would have expanded on with, I think is either you or AJ mentioned, going out to your third parties and letting them know. Take it a step further, and if you're collecting IOCs that you believe might be associated, with the nation state, and share that intelligence with those critical third parties that could potentially be where your risk is. The other area that I've had some success in this sort of situation is setting up the relationships with friendly nation states. So if you're a U.S. company going to, the U.S. intelligence, law enforcement agencies, and other Western nations, right, and sharing intelligence to disrupt illicit activity. Ultimately, that's what you're there to do. But it takes setting up those relationships and those partnerships so that if you get intelligence or you get a feeling that you're being targeted by a nation state, I mentioned earlier, who knows other nation states better than nation states? So go to them and express your concern. Okay, I believe that we might be targeting, or a third party of ours might be the target of an adversary nation state. What can you provide us? And usually it's going to take a little bit of time, but if you've established those relationships, those partnerships to share intelligence, ultimately you'll have some success getting some answers back from those law enforcement and intel agencies from around the world.
So let's take an example, because I think for any security program to be successful, you have to reach out to the business units, reach out to the employee base, say what you're all about, say what you're doing. And let's say you've done that. And an employee comes to you and says that they're being extorted for $10,000 because of inappropriate pictures that were sent to a cyber stalker on a dating website based on some of their direct messages back and forth. The employee suspects that this is coming from somebody that's actually an internal employee. So they're, let's say it's a large organization that's two employees, one who's making the claim, one who's potentially the cyber stalker. How would you go about that fusion center approach? This very much has a trust and safety appeal to it. How would a fusion center go about investigating, again, what kind of technologies and process need to be in place to even investigate something like that?
You're talking about a really sensitive situation, right? And you've got an accusation that may or may not be accurate, may or may not be true. So you got to be very careful with that. So something like this, I would definitely want to talk with physical security and insider threat first, and set up a really confidential investigation. This is not something that's going to go widespread. If I found out about this as a leader of my team, I probably am not even telling my own team. I'm going to start with a discussion, like I said, with insider and with physical, so we can figure out what the proper course of action is to build a secure investigation to protect the rights of everybody involved. The accused isn't guilty of anything yet. And it's really important that we keep this close hold, because this could turn out not to be accurate information, and you could really damage somebody's reputation, which creates a lot of problems for them and even legal obstacles for the company. So I would start with a very tight investigation, interviewing the person who's accusing, who is saying this is a problem, and then trying to get as much information as you can from them, which means you have to create a really safe, healthy environment where they understand we're here to find out what's going on. We're not here to accuse anybody of anything. We want to know what the problem is. I'm not interested in seeing inappropriate pictures. I'm not trying to embarrass anybody, but you have to tell me, first of all, did it happen? Is it a real thing? If this is if somebody's extorting you and saying we have pictures of you and you don't remember sending any, there's a lot of scams like that. So I would certainly want to start with that. Show me the email, show me the threats. Let's find out if this is a real threat first. And then from there, you start digging in further during the investigation. But early on, you want to keep that very quiet. This is a fusion issue. We do have cyber intelligence. We've got a lot of opportunities to go out and check social media and deep dark web and some other areas where we can do some research that would be really beneficial to understand how everybody's connected to one another. Physical security, especially if there's any physical threats involved. And the insider threat often falls in under a physical security organization. If this happens to be an executive, maybe executive protection would be another piece I would look at. But I'm going to keep it very close hold and take the time to get this right. This is a really sensitive investigation. Organizations often make mistakes of either jumping to conclusions too quickly and trying to take action too early, or trying to brush things under the rug, which can create all sorts of other issues with you. HR would be one other organization you might want to have a chat with on this and bring in. But again, really close hold, probably just the leader of HR. They're often tied to insider threat as well. But be careful. It's a scary situation for everybody involved. We want to make sure it's real. We don't want to damage anybody's reputations. We want to take the accusations seriously, though, and make sure we're respecting the employee involved, all the employees involved, and then work from there. But you gotta be careful with that one.
I think AJ pretty much nailed it. I have more of a question than a other like a follow on. It's what happens if the devices used weren't company managed versus if the devices are actually company managed, and where do we draw that line? So if they're doing it from a personal phone and they're sending it to somebody else's personal phone, at what point are we able to get involved? At what point are we able to actually pull indicators off the phone and stuff like that?
I think that's why, the one business unit, that I would add on top of HR is legal, right? They're another key tenant in that initial discussion. Any insider risk problem, you've got to include HR and legal, in my opinion, for that very reason, to get that counsel on how far do we want to go in investigating this.
I was going to add that exactly and say that legal's advice might be at a certain point that this goes to law enforcement. Frankly, looking at the scenario, it probably should go to law enforcement. Again, consult with your legal, consult with your HR. If you're in a large company or even a mid-sized company, you probably have policies that cover this almost exactly. And so you shouldn't be reinventing the wheel here if something like this happens. I think what we do need to think about is what the Fusion Center can offer such an investigation that is probably actually in the possession of the security team, not the InfoSec team, but the larger security team, or maybe on the legal team, and how we could support that, and also how we could mess it up. Because Fusion Centers exist to pass information quickly, and so to AJ's point, you want to think about how you keep some of these things tight. Likewise, depending on how your company is structured and what countries your company does business in, the US has very lax, in comparison to other countries, approaches to a lot of employee privacy issues, right? But if you're working, say, in a GDPR country, right, somewhere in the EU, for example, or other places, even looking at employee devices might be something that you need special dispensation in order to do. So this is an area where you have to balance acting quickly because it's important and not acting rashly because you could undermine the entire thing.
Let's say a little bit, you've gone through all the steps that everybody's gone through here. Let's say they confirm it is an employee that's harassing, and that employee is doing that with a device of interest, which is a corporate laptop, as well as their personal machine, and they're in a foreign country. And they're in a foreign country that is not exactly, that has, law enforcement that is probably not going to really care much. Let's just say that, right? What would you kind of do next?
The first thing is going back to legal, because you mentioned it's in a foreign country, and understanding the dynamics in that country, what we can and can't do. If there is a work-related device, I think we can start to look at some of the activity on the individual's device. Are they going to these dating websites that you're talking about? We can check our logs there. If it's a corporate issued device, we can go ahead and do forensics on it and find out, what was actually on there. And then potentially from a physical perspective is, well, I guess if they're in two different countries, this wouldn't be it. But if they were in the same place, you could see, is this person taking their work issued device, to this person's home address, right? And from a physical, is there a convergence of those? And again, but some of these things, all depend on what your legal is going to say based on the country, company policies, and whatnot. So those are some of the ways that I would start to do this. On the flip side, somebody mentioned going out to the dark web and whatnot, going to, they're not immediately guilty, right? And so is there plausible explanations that this could have happened, somewhere else? Is there, compromised credentials out there? Could somebody have, gotten into their mailbox? Are these pictures in question already exist out on the web somewhere else, right? Those are some of the things that I would be thinking about.
Yeah, I think those are good points. You mentioned looking for other alternatives, right? I spent a little bit of time working with some really good insider threat guys. And one of the things I learned that I've always taken with me is whenever you're dealing with something like that, presumed innocence is really important. A lot of those organizations jump straight to let me get the person. And that's really a poor way of looking at it. And I saw an investigation that comes to mind where some leadership really wanted to jump to a conclusion about, we had some things that had leaked out at the time, and it was, found in Pastebin and then the dark web, and we were able to tie it back to an IP and quickly wanted to look to terminate somebody. But our insider threat guys were the first to say, no, we need to do an investigation and find out maybe they've already been compromised. Just because the information came from that computer doesn't mean the employee willingly made that move. We need to assume otherwise until we're proven, differently. Let's do the investigation and let's find out. And in that instance, it did turn out that that employee wasn't guilty of anything. So, I think Matt makes a really good point that we need to do full due diligence. But in this scenario, as you're going down this path, foreign country, we've confirmed this is bad actions by our people. Yeah, to me that falls straight into legal and HR's position. I'm assuming that becomes a termination situation, shut off a computer, turn it over to law enforcement if they're not going to do it in that country. Maybe have a counseling session with the victim employee to explain what their rights are, and that's a legal and HR discussion at that point, and hopefully take care of them if they need.
I completely agree. I think at this point, the event itself is largely moved out of our world as security or cybersecurity fusion center operators. How the event came to be and how the technology that we are responsible for enabled that event, that's a big deal. And so now what we're doing is we're looking at how did this happen? How were they able to get, does our security policy allow people to plug in a USB stick and put the picture on, or did they email it in? Do people have external email access that don't need it? I'm starting to think about all the controls that should be on my network that are insufficient, not working, I could do better, or are accepted risk. And to me, that's what this is. This whole thing is about that. At this point, HR's got it, legal's got it. Now I'm thinking about the network.
And you're talking about the accepted risk, Jake. I think if you take it to the bigger picture, as you start to go, what, this was accepted risk, and yet now I'm starting to see little incidences popping up over and over, going to the plugging in USBs, right, or whatever it may be, and then educating, creating that shared conscience that I said, we accepted this risk, but what we're finding is I don't think we properly evaluated this risk before. Now we keep seeing this pop up over and over, which is raising the risk. And so
Right.
Now where does that fall within our tolerance?
Or you thought that it fell within your tolerance, and the first time you felt the pain, you're like, nope, we were wrong. That's not within our tolerance.
Right.
The other thing to take into account is that if you don't do anything about this, you just said it's inside of your risk tolerance, like in bright neon letters, right?
Yep.
So the this whole idea of precedence, right, and the actions you take or don't take when something happens screams really loudly. It screams to your employees, it screams to your management, and it screams to your regulators. These things, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, you've said it a couple of times, and I keep coming back to it. Risk is everything, right? That's what this really always comes down to is what is the acceptable risk? And that changes. You guys just pointed to that. It's it's a living thing, as you mentioned. Acceptable risk sometimes is acceptable right until it happens. You can't necessarily conceptualize of how bad it'll be, and you're like, this probably won't happen. We're fine. We'll put that over here, and then that thing happens, and immediately you recognize, or leadership recognizes, and then makes you aware of it. This is no longer an acceptable risk. It's funny how things are very acceptable until they happen to us. So that's a constant evolution. As you said, Matt, also never turn down an opportunity to take advantage of a crisis. It's a great opportunity. A lot of times risks that we're forced to accept are things that maybe people in this room didn't want to accept. And we made that argument to leadership and they said, no, we're going to accept it. Now is a chance to look back and, be careful. We don't want to tell people I told you so, but be in a position to say, maybe we need to reevaluate this. Now we've seen how painful this can be. And if we only invested a little more here and here, we think we could mitigate this risk much further. To me, everything still comes back to risk and bottom line. Those are the languages of leadership when it comes to Intel. Is it going to make us safer? Is it going to make our profitability better? Does it lower our risk so we have less cost? Risk and bottom line are what matter to these folks in leadership. So we have to find better ways to communicate that over and over again. And this would be a good example.
And I think as we're talking about risk and some of the things we also talked about earlier, a fusion center can enable you to take on some risk elsewhere, right? As I think about it, because you're speeding up your response, you're creating a network to defeat a network, as we say. I've had an example where there is intelligence of a bank that was going to be attacked by a nation state, and law enforcement walks in and says, you need to shut down your bank. I mean, we are here to enable business, right? We're in business to conduct business, not to shut everything down. Well, because of all we had set up a good network, it allows us to go, okay, we've got information that we might be attacked, but we've got some mitigating things in place that the Fusion Center can help drastically reduce the impact of that risk manifest. And so that's the other value add, is it can allow you to accept some risks where you couldn't have accepted them before.
To kind of top it off, Jake, you mentioned sometimes it's kind of out of security and out of legal's hands. If the employee in a foreign country still has a laptop and has a live machine, John, I'm sure there's ways that you could certainly do things that box where it completely mitigates the threat.
Yeah, depending on what management software is on it, you can wipe it, you can lock it out, you can deny access, you can do a whole bunch of things. We've even gone far enough to send scripts to target to send it through a boot loop where they just keep going and going and going, and they're never able to access the system again. If we know we're not going to get the system back, they're going to trash it or whatever, might as well just boot loop it.
Yeah, lots of technologies to make live machines not so live anymore.
Right on. Well, guys, it was great. Thank you very much for your time. Appreciate everything. And thank you very much for everybody for joining. We'll have some questions and answer sessions here with Matt, John, and Jake. If anybody wants to submit questions, again, there's a Q&A box down here below. I've got a couple questions side channel. We'll start with Matt. What skill sets do you hire for when you're building out the Cyber Fusion Center? A lot of people say, culture, eat strategy for breakfast. What kind of culture do you ultimately want to, enable with your Cyber Fusion Center? You have, the Trident so displayed in your background. A lot of us come from the IC. Do you go hire a lot of former intelligence community folks? Do you kind of have a good mix? What's been your strategy for building that team of teams, so to speak?
Well, as far as the types of folks, I do like to get a little bit of a mix. I like to get some folks from the IC and law enforcement because they've got those relationships. They speak the same language. It's pretty easy for them to set those relationships up for us as an organization. But one of the biggest things that I'm also looking for, separate from that background, is how collaborative are they? Are they willing to be part of a much bigger team and work across the enterprise? Or do they have the personality to where they want to, hide information and keep it to themselves and just work in a real small group without bringing in the larger enterprise?
Jake, what are your thoughts there? Any different perspectives?
I agree. I think the main thing I'm looking for, honestly, is experts. The whole idea of the Fusion Center is to bring a lot of different kinds of experts together. So you need a couple of generalists to help direct traffic and keep things moving. But what you really need are the experts that you're trying to fuse together. We have a no liaisons rule in our Fusion Center. We don't bring anybody in whose purpose is to communicate between groups. You're a functional expert. You work in your field. You have a business as usual job in your team, and you do that job from inside of the Fusion Center. And so we bring lots of experts together of all different kinds. So I want some government people. I want some academic people. I want some industry people. I want technical experts. I want people with poli-sci degrees. I want all of those things in one place, not any one particular thing. If I have too much of one thing, I'm not fusing anymore.
John, anything more to add on that point?
No, sir. I think they nailed it. Just from working in there, I can say it's beneficial to have you communicate within the team versus having somebody go from one group to another, to another, to another. Things get lost in translation, and it's definitely easier to all be in the same place.
I think one point that was added as well in the video cast was the theory of presumed innocence, which very much has connotations of human resources. How important is human resources within that? Since we're talking, this is fusion. How important is that type of mentality to really bring to a Fusion Center to ultimately enable more thorough investigations, particularly when there's insider threats? What's your thoughts in terms of what is that an important, is a presumed innocence? Do you think that that's an important, kind of way to go about, setting for cultural responsibilities?
Yeah, good question. I don't know that I would even necessarily tackle it that way. I'm not trying to determine someone's innocence, and I think it's on an HR level, it is good to presume someone's innocence. On a security level, I assume everyone is guilty all of the time, no matter what. And we have to walk that line between those things, which is why you want an HR expert in the room with you, so that they can make the right decisions from an HR perspective, and you can make the right decisions from a security perspective. You shouldn't be in the business of being an HR person any more than they should be in the business of being a security person, but instead you work together.
Matt, any thoughts there as well? You're on mute.
Yeah, sorry about that. I would agree with Jake on that one. You know, I'm not trying to be an HR expert. I definitely do want to look at everything as a threat, but I'll let HR deal with it from that perspective.
One aspect from, you know, anytime somebody sets up a cyber fusion center, there's certainly an element of reporting to stakeholders. What have you guys found in terms of what is useful for reporting? I think probably people that, you know, have IC backgrounds or law enforcement backgrounds want some type of daily brief. You know, what do you think is a, you know, good cadence to have to certain stakeholders to ultimately have that transparency? Matt, what's your thoughts there?
I think that it depends on the level of the organization you're talking about. In my experience at the tactical level, folks do want to know every day what's going on in the environment and how are we going to mitigate it. When you get to the senior executives of an organization, I found that on a weekly and or monthly cadence, depending on how high up we would go, to the board of directors, then providing them as part of those quarterly updates, giving the board of directors information on what's going on and what the threats are that we're seeing that we're trying to mitigate.
A question that just came in. We'll send this one to Jake. How do you work with internal teams that believe security trumps getting things done? How do you streamline the checks and balances across software development and cybersecurity?
Oh, good question, and an ongoing challenge, right? And I think bringing up development is actually one of the most important areas to raise this challenge. We've gotten to a place largely within the businesses where we're able to say security protects your business. We're part of the solution, right? We're not a cost center, we're protecting the profit center. And that's the relationship that you need with that group. When working with developers, it's a slightly different story, right? You're talking about changing culture. You're talking about a group of people that has the ability to long-term influence how safe your company is and how safe your businesses are and so on. That means bringing them in early. That means treating our developers kind of like we treat our senior business leaders and really explaining to them why what they're doing or not doing is a risk. Again, it comes back to risk, right? And telling them what they can do to help mitigate those risks. And I think as long as you keep it in that language of risk, the senior managers will understand. You can get the culture wrapped around that. It's a unifying feature.
John, what are your thoughts on that? We've done many of pen tests, CTI type of activities, threat hunt activities. How have you seen this work with developers as well as cybersecurity experts?
I feel like it goes pretty much any which way when it comes to talking with developers and those system administrators. I've seen it where there's groups of them where they'll share one password for the entirety of the system. And I mean, obviously that goes 100% against anything that's secure, but I feel like the people that are doing the work on the day-to-day basis, they end up wanting the easiest way to do their job, which definitely circumvents security in a lot of aspects. So the people that are kind of above them are the ones that we have to explain this to, that have to push down the changes. Just saying like, hey, you cannot share the same password to have administrative rights for the entire domain. So it's got to be made from the higher ups to push it all the way down.
And Matt, I'm sure you've dealt with this issue consistently between, MasterCard and American Family. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, going back to the very beginning when you were talking, it was sort of two aspects of the business side of things. When you bring in the business side into the Fusion Center, it really helps give the security side of the house an understanding of the challenges that they're dealing with and why behind what they're doing. And going back to saying they're developing that shared consciousness, and that makes it a little bit easier to find a solution that everybody's happy with that can enable the business while keeping us as secure as what our risk tolerance is.
And Matt, you made consistent comments during the presentation around different avenues, different law enforcement organizations, foreign law enforcement organizations that are useful to reach out to. Not everybody certainly comes from the intelligence community, but certainly, kind of using that experience, if you're, setting up a fusion center and you have to, get all your processes right internally, what type of international type of forums? Of course, you've got the FSI SACs and, organizations like that, but looking abroad, where would you start in terms of looking at foreign country liaison programs?
Yeah, so coming from the United States government, I'm very familiar with who we're partners with and who we share intelligence with the most. And I sort of came at it from that perspective, being in US companies, US based companies, that is, going to the UK. A lot of the countries over in Europe, they've established programs, the UK having the NCSC, for example, and that going, and then on the United States side, going to the National Cyber Forensics Training Alliance. They've got partnerships not only with the NCSC, but also other countries like Australia and whatnot. But at the same time, you want to go ahead and set up those relationships. If you're a global company, don't pigeonhole yourself just to those Western aligned countries. Try and get into some of the Middle Eastern, some of the just all across the globe is the bottom line.
And I mean, do you generally find that you get a pretty decent response? I mean, you know how the speed of business works, right? The speed of business is a lot different than certainly the speed of government. Have you found that that when you kind of trying to push the speed of business, you get decent answers at a decent time frame?
You've got to build up the framework, because the government isn't fast and they are going to be hesitant to sharing intelligence with you. So you've got to build the relationship and the trust, and make sure that they understand how you can prevent attacks, especially if you can tie it back to something that they care about. In the beginning, as I formed those relationships, no, it was really, really slow. Sometimes it takes months to get an answer back. But over time, as you build that relationship, then you can start getting some time sensitive intelligence that you can actually action.
Jake, any further any experiences similar?
I apologize. I was typing a little message in the window and I didn't hear the question.
Yeah, no worries. Just I guess any experience on where to start in terms of foreign liaison partnerships that are fruitful.
Oh yeah, great question. So you can start with your regulatory bodies in the countries that you work in. If you're not in a heavily regulated industry, look at the information sharing groups in that area. Look at the professional organizations and pivot from there. There are ISACs or ISAC-like organizations for many industries now. Dealing internationally, there are central hubs for sharing a lot of this information. Now, many of them are no more than a simple email list, or are a group of professionals that gets together for drinks outside of a pandemic environment, of course, from time to time. And that's where you have to start. In our case, because we are a global company and we have presence in nearly 100 countries, we have people in those countries already who already have contacts, and then we pivot off of those contacts to find the security contacts in those companies that we see as peers or partners, or in some cases, friendly competitors.
Well, it's the top of the hour. Jake, Matt, John, and AJ, I can't thank you guys enough for joining. Certainly thank you to all of our guests and participants. We will certainly have this live on our Nisos website here in the next couple of days. That concludes this webinar. Have a great afternoon, everybody.